Something that's always fascinated me when it comes to collecting game consoles and just having them and using them and looking at them and being impressed by them is revisions. Specifically, revisions that make things smaller. I always get this sense of like, wow, they took this system and now it's only this big? It's, I don't know, maybe it's not really that impressive, but I always think it's kind of cool. Like for example here we have the original 2013 Xbox One, which I actually really like the design of. Like, lots of people dunked on it just because they're like, oh, it looks like a VCR from the 80s. That is a compliment. VCRs from the 80s are super cool, and I actually love that this design kind of does feel inspired by that, even if unintentionally. But it's also really large and really bulky, and it also has that external power brick, which I was gonna put in the frame, but I didn't feel like it. But it's like that big. It's a big old brick. In addition to this thing, so you got this sitting in your entertainment center or on your desk or wherever, and there's also a big old brick hanging off the side. It takes up a lot of space, and there's actually a lot of empty space inside of this thing. If you've ever opened one of these up, there's like the optical drive and the processor and the heatsink, and the hard drive is either on this side or this side. I can't remember. I think it's on this side. But this back corner here is just empty. There's just nothing there. This thing has so much empty space in it. I think Microsoft was just scared of their systems overheating after dealing with the red ring of death with the Xbox 360. But either way, a few years later, they made this thing. And it is so much smaller, and having them in the frame like this really does not emphasize that, because it only looks like it's a bit shorter on this side. But it is significantly less deep. It is significantly less tall. Let's see if I can put these next to each other. That's a better comparison shot, even though they're kind of out of frame. But you can see it's much less deep, it's much less tall, it's just much smaller overall, and there's no external power brick. It just gives me that feeling of like, wow, they took the Xbox One and they made it smaller and better. And I just think that's cool, and I like having both versions so I can just sort of like do a little comparison. And that's not even mentioning the Xbox One X, which is basically the same size as the One S here, but like 4 times more powerful. And they also somehow made that work with an internal power supply. Microsoft's engineering is actually really well done on the later Xbox One models. The original one is kind of big and creaky and plasticky and VCR looking, but the S and the X are very well designed. I like the way this looks a lot. But these are kind of modern. Console revisions have been happening for a long time. Like, a long time? If we want to be really picky, I can go back to something like the Atari 2600 that had tons of revisions. Or heck, even I think the Fairchild Channel F, like the first game console ever, had some revision where they changed some of the I can't remember exactly. I don't know much about that system, but I swear that it had a revision. But this has been going on forever. Like, for example, my Atari 2600 model, which I will show you here. This thing right here. This is not the first revision of the Atari 2600. It looks pretty similar, but there were 2 versions before this one. The very first version was ever so slightly larger, was a little bit more rounded along the bezel, and was a lot heavier, and it had, instead of just 4 switches, it had 6. 2 of the switches, the difficulty switches, are now little switches on the back here. The very first revisions had them up here along with these other switches. And then they made a second version that looked just like this one, but with all 6 switches. And then this is the third one, which moved 2 of the switches to the back. So this sort of thing has been going on for a long time. Revisions happen all the time. There were later revisions of this. People would probably recognize the Atari 2600 Junior. There was one that looked like this, but it was all black instead of this wood trim. People call that the Darth Vader model. And then they made the much smaller 2600 Juniors. I don't have one of those. I believe there are 2 different versions of that. One that has like the little rainbow emblem that goes all the way along the top, and one that just has it like a little stripe. Just Google Atari 2600 Junior. You'll see 2 different versions of it. Those are much smaller. I want to get one of those at some point, but this is the only one I have right now, and it is not the first version. It's not really any smaller, though. A lot of times, though, the most impressive revisions are the ones that make things significantly smaller. This is one of my favorite examples. So here we got Model 1 Sega Genesis, which in and of itself is not the very first revision of this thing. Not even discussing, like, internal revisions, because there are tons of them for the Genesis. Like, if we're just talking internal motherboard revisions, this is still the Model 1 Genesis, but it's like the 6th version of it. But at least in terms of external revisions, the very first models had the words high definition graphics written along the bezel here, which is always funny because I guess high definition wasn't really a defined standard back in the late 80s. They just said that because they felt like it, even though this thing does not do any resolutions higher than 240p as far as I'm aware. But yeah, this is the Model 1 Genesis. It's pretty large. It's not, huge, but it's pretty large. But, then we get something like this thing, the Genesis 3. I love this thing. It's so small. It's one of those things like, sure, even by the time this came out in like the mid-late 90s, the Genesis wasn't really new technology at all. But it's like, oh, it's a whole Genesis. It's an actual Genesis in here. This is all still native hardware, and they made it so small. Like, compare this to the Model 1. It's only about the size of the little bezel that the cartridge slot is on. This thing is so much smaller. It is missing some features, which is also something that happens a lot with revisions. I've talked about my Sega stuff before. I made some random video about Sega things a few months back. But this removed stereo sound. There is only mono sound. And it also removed support for a lot of peripherals. Like, out of the box, this does not work with the Power Base Converter or Game Genies or the 32X. There are ways to restore a lot of that functionality. And Virtua Racing, the Genesis game that had its own chip inside the cartridge, similar to like Star Fox for the Super Nintendo. This would not support that out the box, but you can mod them to restore functionality. The mods are kind of tricky because it's a bunch of tiny wires that you have to wire to these little itty-bitty pins. I'm not very good at that. I got one wire attached, which is all you needed to restore Power Base Converter functionality. I talked about that again more in that other Sega video. But I can plug the big old Power Base Converter, this thing, that was meant for the Genesis 1, jams in the top here. Now you can play your Master System games. This will now work on this thing, and it looks absurd, but it works, and that's also super neat. And I also restored Virtua Racing. That's an easier mod to do as well, but this particular Genesis 3 still does not work with the 32X. That takes more work than I'm willing to put into it right now. But yeah, and then we have the in-between that I kind of skipped over, the Model 2 Genesis, which is quite a bit larger than the 3, but still a good bit smaller than the 1, which I can't fit all of them in frame right now. Honestly, this is probably my least favorite Genesis, if I had to rank them. Not that it, really matters, and I'm not going to, go online and be like, oh, the Model 2 sucks. And no, I like them all. It's just, the Model 1 is such a cool design. It just looks like 80s hi-fi equipment, kind of the same vibe as the original Xbox One that I was talking about earlier. And the Model 3 is just so cool because it's so small. The Model 2 is just it's in between. It does everything. It just doesn't look as cool. It doesn't work with the Power Base Converter because it doesn't fit, just because the way the plastic is shaped. Literally, that's the only reason why it doesn't work, is because it doesn't fit. I just don't think it's as interesting. It's the model of choice, though, if we're going with the 32X, because it's the only one that the 32X doesn't look absolutely stupid plugged into. It looks really dumb plugged into the Model 1, and it looks absolutely ridiculous plugged into Model 3, if you can even get it to work, which takes a lot of modding. But I already talked about Sega stuff, so we're going to move on. Actually, no. I'm still a little bit more Sega stuff, because we haven't talked about the Master System. This thing is long. That's its big defining characteristic, not the silly diagram on the front or the trapezoid type shape. It is long. This will not fit in most entertainment shelves. I'm pretty sure in terms of just actual width, this is the widest console I have. I'm pretty sure only a full-size PS5 would beat this if I had one of those, which I do not. It's big, and it needed a revision to make it smaller, which we got even here in North America, but it is very uncommon. This is probably one of the rarest systems I own, a North American Master System Model 2. And, it's quite a bit smaller. Having my camera angled like this doesn't really give me the best view of all the things I'm trying to show, because I put the new smaller one out in front, and then the perspective doesn't really show how much smaller it is because the old one's farther in the distance. But, you still can see, line them up, way less wide. We're missing some features, though. Doesn't play card games. And usually these also have really poor video quality. Out of the box, these only do RF out. Screw the cable in the antenna jack on your TV and turn it to channel 3. This one is modded. Again, something I mentioned when I was talking about Sega stuff. That was fun. It turned out really well. But yeah, this is another one of those things where like, oh, they made the Master System so small. But you can go even farther than that because, the Genesis Model 3 with the silly power base converter plugged into it, I think actually wins the title for smallest Master System. This is the same console now as this. These are the same thing. This is a Master System. This is right now a Master System. How bizarre. I could throw my copy of, Sonic, 8-bit Sonic in any of these things and it would work. It's just weird. It's just neat. You know that meme picture of like Marge Simpson just being like, "Oh, I just think they're neat." That's me for like everything I talk about on here. This is just where I'm like, this is a neat thing. This is also a neat thing. Look at this thing. It's pretty neat. But that's enough Sega stuff. We are moving on now. All right, now we had to talk about this one. This is probably my single favorite console revision. What a weird thing to say. I don't care. This is probably my single most favorite console revision of any because PS2, the original one, pretty large. Built-in power supply, hard drive bay, whole bunch of stuff going on. So I will say they kind of cheated a bit in that they got rid of features to make this happen. The hard drive bay is gone. The power supply is external. Kind of. They did make a revision of the revision that made the power supply internal again. This is not that. But the PS2 Slim, it's so tiny. It's like a sliver. It's not even as tall as the little base where the hard drive bay is on the original model. This blew my mind back in like the mid 2000s. It's like you have the big PS2, it's huge, and they just made it this small. They just did it. It's just tiny now. There were several revisions of this as well. Varying degrees of, because they actually slightly changed the architecture of the chipsets in these. I don't really fully understand how to explain that, but when they went to the PS2 Slim, there was some slight compatibility issues with PS2 games, and a few more with PS1 games, and there were revisions of the Slims that fixed some of those compatibility issues. This one's one of the better ones, but it's not the last one. There was the 990,000 series that still looked a lot like this. The glossy part was extended over this whole left side, and the power supply was internal again. So they did make one that was exactly this big with an internal power supply. This is not that one, though. But that's okay. It's still just really cool how small this is. I use my larger PS2 more, though, just because the hard drive bay is actually super useful for installing games on. I have this modified, so I have all my games installed on the hard drive bay. But yeah, probably one of my favorite instances of, hey, here's a console, and now it's way smaller. Followed pretty closely by the system that came right before it, the original PlayStation. Which, it always is funny to me because, this is pretty commonly referred to as the PS1 nowadays. But, that wasn't the case back in the 90s when there was no other PlayStations to compare it to. It was just the PlayStation, or PSX sometimes. But then when PS2 came out and they made a smaller version of the PS1, they leaned into that name, PS1, in little lowercase letters. It's the PS1. So much smaller, once again. Same sort of cutbacks, though, as a PS2. Well, there's no hard drive bay in this, but the power supply. Internal on here, external on here. And there was never a version of this that had an internal power supply. But still, so much smaller. And I really like the design of this thing. I did like 3 takes already trying to describe why I do, and I couldn't think of anything other than stupid adjectives. So I don't really know why I like the design of this. Once again, I just think it's neat. So I actually lied about the PS2 having the most impressive size reduction. This is actually probably the most impressive size reduction. The PS3 here. The original model, this one, which once again is not the very original model. This is not a backwards compatible one. I like to get consoles that I can refurbish and try and keep as reliable as possible. And the backwards compatible models are just so prone to heat issues and issues with the yellow light from their graphics chip overheating. They are hard to properly maintain. This is one that has the 65 nanometer processor and graphics chip, runs a lot cooler, much less likely to overheat, but it still has the same vibe as the very original model, and it's still the same size. And that's what's important when we're comparing it to this thing, which is tiny. Once again, it's like barely as big as the underneath the tray where the disc goes on the original model. It's this thing is so much smaller. It's so much lighter. I really should have completely thought of a different way to mount my camera because this is not a good angle for all of this, and I'm kind of committed at this point. But going back to the point I was just making about reliability, I don't care what anyone says about the stupid sliding door, whatever. These are, I almost want to say objectively, the most reliable PS3s. They run the coolest. The sliding tray, although the plastic does feel kind of cheap, makes the disk drive really easy to access and really easy to maintain. You basically never have overheating issues with these. There's a lot less going on inside of them. Much easier to work on, in my opinion. This thing runs flawlessly. And this is another system where I have, where's the hard drive bay? I don't even know where it is right now. In here, I think? I can't even remember wherever the hard drive bay is in this. I have this modded with all my games installed on it as well. That was kind of a pain. Soft modding a PS3 is a pain. Some systems are easy, like the Wii. Wii is super easy to soft mod. PS3s are not, in my opinion. I got it to work in the end, though. But once again, I love they made a PS3 this small? How'd they do that? And it's just cool. The more I get into this video, the more I feel like it's kind of pointless because I don't really have anything terribly interesting to say other than, look at big thing, now small, cool. But we're going to keep going. I've already committed. We're this far into the video and we haven't even mentioned Nintendo yet. They've been doing this since forever too. And honestly, some of their revisions are some of my favorite designs. And that's slightly different than the most impressive in terms of size reduction. But they're just like my favorite designs. Like, I like the way they look. I like the way they work. Case in point, the top loader NES. Still kind of impressive in terms of making bigger things smaller. But in terms of reliability, this is the way to go. And that's what a lot of people will say about it. You know, you have your top loading cartridge slot, much more normal than, you know, whatever this nonsense is that they did. Don't get me wrong. The original NES is just such a cool classic thing. This is the one I use more, though. It had the same issue as the Model 2 Master System originally, in that by default, out of the factory, these only had RF out, which is just awful, especially in a modern day scenario when you're trying to connect something like this up to your modern TV. This is another project I did not too long ago. RGB mod for this with the NES RGB. This is wired up exactly the same way as a Super Nintendo's multi-out. So it does composite video, S-video, RGB, everything. If a Super Nintendo cable works with a Super Nintendo, it'll work with this particular NES top loader. So much more capable in terms of video output now. But this thing's just much more reliable for getting games to load, at least. So if you can get one of these and get a good way to get video out from it other than just RF, best version of the NES. And it's just, I don't know, the front loading design's neat for what it is. Kinda sucks though from an actual design perspective. Regular top loading cartridge slot, much better. No surprises here. Anyone watching this video to this point probably knew that this is what would be up next. Yeah, the original Super Nintendo to the Super Nintendo Mini, or Junior, as most people actually call it nowadays. I found that Super Nintendo Mini has gone out of style when referring to this ever since the Super Nintendo Classic Mini from a few years back. That sort of stole the name Super Nintendo Mini from this thing. So now more people call this the Super Nintendo Junior or Super Nintendo 2. Just a trend I noticed. Like a lot of these revisions, we did lose a few features on the transition from here to here. And that's another thing I like to do with these systems I buy is restore the missing features from the larger models so I can use the smaller ones with all the features restored. And in this case, that was a power LED and RGB out. And this one has those now. And RGB out is a really great mod to do for this system because there are also internal variants of the Super Nintendo. If you're into trying to run Super Nintendos on modern displays, you'd be aware of the one-chip variations, which is something Nintendo did around 94, 95. Consolidated the PPUs, or picture processing unit, basically the graphics chips, into the original Super Nintendo model had 2 graphics chips and a CPU, and later revisions of the large full-size one combined all those into one single chip, and it's called the one-chip model. And those have much sharper video output and a few minor compatibility issues. People will also mention that. This is not a one-chip model. This is a SNS CPU GPM02 model, for what it's worth. Basically, all that matters is it's not one chip. It's also not the very first revision. The very first revision had a separate sound card that plugged into the back. This does not have that. This is a sort of intermediate revision. But then when they went to this, all Super Nintendo Juniors are one-chip versions. They all use that design. But by default, they don't have the high-quality RGB video wired up. So you have the higher quality video output that doesn't actually make it to the AV output plug. And it's not too difficult to restore. I did that recently. This LED, I did a long time ago, actually. This was, if I'm just getting a little nostalgic here, putting in an LED to my Super Nintendo Junior here was actually the very first soldering job I ever did. This was one of the first times I ever opened up and started working on the insides of my systems, was to put that light in. And it works great. And it also has great picture quality now that I RGB modded it last year. So this is my preferred Super Nintendo. I just really like the design of it, and it's also interesting how there were different revisions of this, or rather different designs in different regions. Everyone's aware who'd be watching this of the North American versus the European and Japanese Super Nintendo systems, how they look totally different. But both Japan and North America got this same design for the revision. Europe did not get this at all. But the design language merged here. The Super Nintendo Junior and the Super Famicom Junior in Japan both look like this, whereas the original Super Famicom looks totally different from this. And then we've got this thing. I think this actually wins the award for the dumbest revision. The Wii to the Wii Mini. Barely earns its name because it's only marginally smaller than the original Wii. Like, you lose a little bit along the back here, but it's basically the same width, basically the same height, and like 1 inch shorter. And in losing that 1 inch, this thing lost a ton of features. Out of the box, this plays Wii discs, and that's it. Nothing else. It does nothing else, which is terrible compared to how many features the original Model Wii had. Especially the first revisions of these, like this one is. Wii discs, GameCube discs, Virtual Console games, WiiWare titles. You had all the controller ports and memory card ports for GameCube stuff, which some Wii games used as well. Wi-Fi connectivity to download things, use streaming apps, online play. I know that stuff's all defunct by this point, but still, it was part of the console's feature set. SD card slot, so you could like load things on it. This lost all of that. It plays Wii discs and does nothing else, which was such a terrible decision, especially in 2012 when this came out. This could have been such a good, affordable, standard definition, but still, little streaming box around a decade ago. But it didn't. It couldn't. This one can, though. Once again, I've cracked this thing open and done a ton of projects to it. It has an internal SD card slot. It theoretically does have internet connection if I wired up the Nintendo wired Ethernet adapter thing to the USB port on the back. I don't do that because who cares? And component video is restored because that was also missing. This thing could only do composite video out, which was terrible. 2012, we were already well into the era of HD TVs. We were just a few years away from 4K TVs taking off. This thing couldn't put out any better video signal than an NES from the 80s. Unless you mod it, which was really difficult. This was probably one of the hardest mod jobs I've ever done. And there are going to be people out there who are really experienced at modding consoles who'll be like, oh, you had a hard time with that? Oh, it's so easy. But seriously, if you're just teaching yourself how to do this, wiring up wires to the tiny little pins directly on the video output chip, it's tough. I did it, but it was not easy, and sometimes I worry that it's going to just come apart someday just by staring at it wrong. But it does work. I do get component video out of this, and it looks very nice. But one thing I do like, though, I like top-loading trays. I just think they're cool. I like the PS3 top loader. I like the PS2 top loader. It's just something about them. They're way more basic. They're way more reliable, though. One of the biggest failure points of the Wii and any other console with a slot loading or even tray loading disk drive is the gears and motors and all the little mechanisms that go along with getting your disc in and out. Here it's just a little hinge with a spring. It's never going to break unless you're stupid. I like the matte, rough, plasticky finish. This feels more like something from like the 90s, like the same sort of plastic that's on like a Super Nintendo or something, as opposed to like the really smooth, glossy plastic of the normal Wii. But These are cool if you mod them, because then it's like, oh, look at all these cool things the Wii Mini can do. I have so many games loaded on this, all my Wii games, all my GameCube games, emulators, all the old like NES through N64 ROMs loaded on this. But it was a lot of work, and it's so much easier to just do that on a regular Wii. It's so incredibly easy to software mod these. This is harder, just because you're missing a lot of the stuff necessary. I'll always recommend original model Wii's, or even the Family Edition, the in-between revision that looked about the same, but the text was moved to be horizontal instead of vertical, and you lost GameCube support, out of the box at least. If you soft mod it, you can restore GameCube support through the SD card slot and use a classic controller plugged into a Wii remote. These are great boxes for emulating and playing old games, especially if you want to hook something up to a tube TV and get that authentic 240p experience without actually having to buy a ton of old hardware. These are the way to go. I used this Wii as my retro gaming box for years before I actually started going out and buying old systems. And if anyone wants to play old games and doesn't want to bother with all the headaches that come with, spending money and refurbishing a whole bunch of old hardware, just get a Wii. It covers so much stuff really, really well. That's my little tangent about the Wii. Wii Mini is kind of silly. I like it anyways, though. I just think it's neat. To finish this up, though, handhelds. They get revisions too, all the time. Maybe even more so than home consoles, at least in Nintendo's case. The Game Boy to the Game Boy Pocket. Huge size reduction. This is also one of those really impressive ones. Like, if you compare them, it's significantly smaller. Better screen, way smaller. I hardly ever use this thing, though, because it has one fatal flaw. It uses AAA batteries. This is the only thing in my entire collection of game hardware that uses AAA batteries. The only thing. Everything else, all the other Game Boys, either use AA's or rechargeable batteries. All of my controllers either use AA's or rechargeable batteries. Game Boy Pocket loses a ton of points because I have to keep around AAA batteries just for this thing. There was another revision of the Game Boy, only in Japan, the Game Boy Light, which basically looks like a Game Boy Pocket with a larger battery cover on the back because it does use AA's, and it has a backlight. A really, really terrible backlight that looks like, remember those like backlit watches? You press the button on the side and it would glow like kind of this weird neon blue color. It's basically that. I don't have one of those though. They only came out in Japan. They're very expensive to import over to the US, but it's cool. One day I'd like to get one, but Game Boy Pocket. Really, really cool revision in terms of like just size reduction. Absolutely hate having to keep around AAA's for this thing. Last one we're going to talk about. I have other consoles that have revisions, like I have a original Xbox 360 and the 360E, and then various different, 3DS systems and blah, blah, blah. None of those impress me as much as these other ones, and we got to wrap this up at some point. The original DS to the DS Lite, also a really impressive revision, because this thing is just, what is this trying to be? It looks like it's almost trying to be like a PDA or something. You had like the ads with people holding the stylus and typing out like PictoChat messages. It's like, oh, there's your DS. You can communicate with people. PictoChat's a fun novelty. I used it all the time back in school when I had like friends in marching band that would have DSs and stuff, and we would just PictoChat on the bus. But it doesn't have any real purpose as a communication device. If you were PictoChatting with someone, you were already in the same room as them. Anyways, tangent over for that. The design of this thing is kind of silly. This is my original DS, though, that I've had for, like 19 years now. A really long time. I got this not long after launch. I used it until I got a 3DS XL in 2013. It's seen better days. It's an overall pretty good shape. There's a nice big crack along here that I had to super glue this part of the plastic back on. These things are pretty fragile. The plastic in them is known for being pretty brittle. This didn't actually break from being dropped or anything. The right speaker stopped working, and so I opened it up, and there's screws underneath these little rubber feet here, and down here I believe as well, and one of them was really stuck, and I was using too much force with the screwdriver, and it cracked the plastic just because I was pressing on it too hard. I fixed the speaker though. The wire had come undone and needed to be soldered back onto the board that connects down to the ribbon cable that goes into the system. These things are really difficult to work on. Anything with a hinge is really difficult to work on. Bit of an aside. Well, kind of, because this DS Lite I actually made from parts from several different semi-functioning DS Lite systems and combined them all into one fully working DS Lite system, and it was a pain. Oh my gosh, threading wires and ribbons through these little hinges is awful. It did it though. So this is technically a slightly unique DS Lite in that the black ones, the pure black ones, are usually fully glossy. Like the top is glossy here, and the bottom is also glossy. This one is not glossy. This was originally a red DS Lite, which has a matte black bottom half and a red glossy top half. And I combined that with parts from a glossy black system. So now I got this weird one that you wouldn't really notice it's not fully stock unless you knew that. But there was never a DS that was glossy black on the top and matte black on the bottom. It was all glossy. But this one's parts from two different systems. And, it's in good working shape now. Working on this was not fun, though. But this is a great... I haven't turned anything on this whole time. This is the first time we've seen something actually be used. This was a great revision, though, in terms of the original DS. You didn't lose any features. It's just so much smaller. Looks so much nicer, so much more modern. Screens are way better. The screens on this actually are kind of garbage. They're just... They have awful viewing angles. Their colors are really washed out. I used this thing for 9 years, but screens on this are much better. The only minor disadvantage is the Game Boy Advance slot. Your games will stick out like that. Who really cares? Didn't actually lose any features on this revision. It was everything this one was, but better. This one is still... I'm going to keep this around forever. This has been my system since a long time ago, and I'm going to continue to use it sometimes just because I think it's neat. It's cool. And most importantly, I actually kind of consider it the most comfortable DS. This is the only system I can actually play Mario Kart DS on and be drifting constantly with the R button and not get hand cramps. I don't know what it is about the way it's shaped or the way the buttons are spaced out. Every single other DS model, from all the DS Lites and DSIs and 3DSs and 2DSs, will all eventually give me hand cramps if I'm playing Mario Kart for too long. This one does not. So this is my Mario Kart DS machine, which is what it was for all those years, and I just noticed I feel like I'm missing a... There's supposed to be a little rubber piece there? I think so. I think I'm missing a little rubber piece there. Oops. Oh well. But I think that's it. Darn, now I'm going to have to find one of those little rubber pieces. That's all I wanted to talk about. I don't feel like busting out the 3DSs. Those are modern enough. Everyone knows what the differences between those are. And those are less about being smaller because those were kind of backwards in that the small versions came first and then they made the XLs because people wanted larger ones. So it's not as impressive in that sense. But yeah, I don't know what the point of this video was.